President of Lafayette College, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of both Lafayette and LVAIC, the Lehigh Valley Association of Independent Colleges, to this second program in our series, Facing Higher Education's Future. LVAIC, as I think most of you know, is a consortium of the private colleges in Eastern PA that includes Cedar Crest, DeSales, Lafayette, Lehigh, Moravian, and Muhlenberg College. And in 2019, these institutions are celebrating 50 years of collaboration. And I'll just pause for a moment and say, as someone who has belonged to several other higher ed consortia, there are very few that are as long-lived and as successful as LVAIC. And so it's a tremendous honor to be part of this strong consortium. We're commemorating this milestone with an educational series focused on the changing landscape of higher education called Facing Higher Education's Future. Through this program, we're providing opportunities for faculty and staff in all of the LVAIC schools to explore key topics regarding the dynamic higher ed environment. Lafayette is particularly pleased to have the opportunity to host this event and today's speaker. Lafayette is currently in the third year of an ambitious strategic initiative called Affordability and Distinction Through Growth, whose goal is to become an institution that allows us to admit talented students without regard to their families' resources. And our plan to achieve this goal includes adding 400 students and 40 faculty over an 8-year period. This initiative and the impact it will have on Lafayette are reflective of the changes taking place in higher education as a whole. And we hope that you also will find these opportunities to learn and to network with your colleagues valuable as our institutions all continue to evolve to meet the changing needs of our students and of the higher ed landscape. Now I'm very pleased to turn things over to Lafayette Provost Abu Rizvi, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Allison. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Nathan Graw to Lafayette and to this LVAIC event. Nate has been on a swing through Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which has taken him to the state legislature and also to Rutgers. He's also managed to avoid at least 10 inches of snow in Minnesota. So I'm sure he's glad he's here. I know he feels a little guilty that he didn't have to shovel and somebody else did. But I'm sure he's glad to see trees in bloom here. Nate is the Ada M. Harrison Distinguished Teaching Professor in Social Sciences at Carleton College, and he's been on the faculty there since 1999. Nate earned his BA from St. Olaf College and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. His work as a labor economist studies the connections between family background, such as parental income, family size, and other factors, and the educational and labor market outcomes. Nate got interested in the work that you're about to hear when he did a stint in academic administration at Carleton. And it was in 2009, when he was working on a strategic planning effort, that he became interested in looking more deeply at demographic trends and how they impact higher education, and what colleges and policymakers may do to achieve their institutional and national goals. This work resulted in a book, Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education, which I know many of you have read. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Graw.
So thank you for having me and thank you for joining me. It really is a privilege to be here, given what's back home waiting for me. I think actually the snow will be melted, so that just contributes even more to my spousal deficit, I guess. So as we start out, as often as an economist, a member of dismal science, I'm scheduled right before drinks. And I guess there can be some of that in this talk, but I don't prefer to view what I'm about to share as something that should be depressing or discouraging. It's challenging. But I am reminded of the time when I entered the dean's office. I had a 3-year stint as associate dean of the college. And early in the fall, so I was about 3 months into the position, still drinking from the fire hose, I was blindsided by a budget issue. Some significant cuts I was going to have to, I had the finances part of the dean's office under me, the operating budgets. And this was 2009, so I said yes to this, knowing I had cuts, so here were some additional cuts. And as I drove home, I had a pit in my stomach, which I later associated with just being an administrator. and I don't have that so often anymore now back in faculty. And I was thinking about these conversations I was going to have, and I wasn't enjoying my position that well. But it dawned on me about halfway home that it's actually for moments like that that I'd said yes to the position. It's not always fun to think about, but on the day that a faculty member comes to me and says, hey, could I have $500 because I've got this great opportunity for student-faculty research? Well, of course I said yes, and I felt really good, and that was a fun day in the office, but anybody would have said yes. It literally didn't matter who was sitting in the seat. It's for the moments of challenge that we take up leadership roles. So whether you're a faculty member or you are an administrator, as we go through this challenging information, I would encourage you to take that attitude, that this is our opportunity, an opportunity to make a significant difference on campuses that have been here for many, many years, generations, and we hope will be around for generations more. But whether or not we succeed at fulfilling our mission for generations more depends on the choices that we make. And every generation of higher ed leadership faces challenges, and maybe this one is just ours. So demographic change is nothing new. We've been reshaped already by demographic change, and some of these trends have been long-standing and persistent. So one of those trends is migration. We see migratory patterns. This is from the American Community Survey of 2016, looking at the net migration rate of children. And we see some patterns, regardless of the year you choose, that are pretty persistent, that people with young children are moving off of the coasts, off of the West Coast in particular. There's a recent survey by Edelman Trust Barometer, is the name of the group. And they were asking Californians about their thoughts about moving. Over half of Californians said that they were considering moving. It seemed to be attributed to the high housing price cost. Now, I don't suppose that over half of Californians are going to move, but it's a suggestion that housing prices are really a significant impediment to living on the West Coast. And in some parts of the East Coast as well. 63% of millennials in that survey said that they were considering a move. And I think that underscores that these challenges of housing prices, which make it difficult in some regions of the country, are particularly acute for young families. And so we see movement out of New England and the Atlantic and off of the West Coast, moving typically toward the South and the Southwest in particular. My part of the country there in the upper Midwest is either a net winner or a net loser, depending on the year, but not as big of an effect. And that's been reshaping the nation and reshaping things for higher education. We see differences in fertility across ethnic groups. So this headline was a few years ago. It turns out it wasn't true once we did the final tallies. Non-Hispanic whites remained just over 50% of babies born. But it's a reminder that when, it's not if, but when we cross that 50% threshold, it's not going to be a new phenomenon. We've been having this shift in young people toward non-Hispanic whites, and we've been seeing that for years, such that now we definitely experience this on our campuses. This is nothing new. We see differences in fertility across geography. So this is the total fertility rate by state in year 2007. Total fertility measures how many babies a woman would have if she proceeded through her life cycle, matching the fertility rates by age that we see at a point in time. This is what a birth boom looks like in the United States. You need about 2,100 babies born per 1,000 women to replace the population with fertility alone. So you need 1,000 babies to replace the women, 1,000 to replace matched males, and then you have some people who don't have babies and so on, that's the additional 100. So 2,100 babies. All of the blue states in this map were exceeding the replacement rate. The darkest blue is 5% or more above replacement rate. The orange states were not meeting replacement. So while the nation was having babies at a rate that would replace the population, and then we could add on additional babies with immigration, the Northeast not so much. Vermont was leading the way with 1,715 babies. Now, Vermont wasn't unique in the sense that if you looked at Japan or you looked at Europe, low fertility is common in the developed world. The United States is a bit of an outlier. But in 2007, while the country was having babies at a fairly fast clip, not so much so in the Northeast. In Vermont, and those deepest orange states in this map, we're looking at fertility rates that are 15 to 20% below the replacement rate. And then something happened. So in 2008, the financial crisis hit us all. And I think on most of our campuses, the experience was that that was a really trying time, and that maybe we are just now getting out from underneath the financial consequences. But unfortunately, I don't think the financial crisis is done with us just yet. Because while we were experiencing economic uncertainty and challenges, young families were experiencing that same economic uncertainty. And they responded pretty predictably by thinking that maybe now wasn't the best time to have kids. And the total fertility rate fell by about 10% in the span of just 3 years. Now, since we've seen financial recovery, we've seen stock market recovery, we've seen low unemployment, we've seen an increase in labor force participation, lots of measures to suggest that the economy has recovered. In terms of fertility, we haven't seen a recovery. 2017 is the latest data available from the CDC, and the total fertility rate in 2017 was 3% lower than that in 2016. So we saw this pretty precipitous drop and then a continued glide downward. So if we look by state, the map now looks like this. This is the same color coding. I've had to add a deeper red to capture states that are 20% or more below the replacement rate. There are now 12 states that are lower than where Vermont was in 2007. And we can see that there are only 2 states in the Union that are producing babies at the replacement rate or above. That's South Dakota and Utah. Anybody here from those states? So that just underscores how few people are in those states. So it's great for them. And if you have family members in South Dakota or Utah, you go ahead and send them a thank you note for doing their part. And I will note, if I want to send my wife a thank you note, we have 4. We did one after the financial crisis, so we're doing our part. But there just aren't enough of those people to change the fact that we are barring some massive shift in immigration. We're going to see fewer children starting about 18 years after the financial crisis, so mid-2020s. Now, I'm not the first to observe that fact. The first place I saw this data came in a strategic planning exercise, and the president decided to kick it off with a data exhibit from key administrators. And so I saw the WICHE data, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, produces forecasts of high school graduates. And so this is what it looks like if you take a long frame. And what we can see is that we had many, many years where we had increasing numbers of high school graduates. High school graduation rates were on the rise, and we had increasing numbers of students. And so we had a long period of rise. John McGee, the author of a book called Breakpoint, pointed out that when you're in that experience of every class larger than the previous class, you can paper over a fair number of less than best practices. But when we hit the plateau, we're kind of in the middle of the plateau nationally, all of a sudden those less than best practices start to catch up with you and you start to experience the stress. And for the nation, we can anticipate in the mid-2020s that we're going to not only see a plateau but then a decline in universities. Now, the Northeast is interesting because we saw in that map that even during the baby boom that was happening in 2007, you all were taking part. You've had low fertility for a while. And so if we look at the change in numbers of high school graduates from 2012 to 2028, the Northeast can expect to see a decline that's relatively large compared to the country. And if we look, for instance, at the profile for Pennsylvania, we see that you all already been in this part of the country in a period of decline. So Pennsylvania has, according to WICHE, 7% fewer high school graduates now than at the peak. And there's another 5% drop to go. And we can see that it's not clear that we've hit a bottom. It's not just Pennsylvania. Ohio is off 9% with 12% more to go. New Jersey off 7% with 12% more to go. New York is a strong area with only 4% loss with 3% to go according to WICHE. Massachusetts -4 with 9% to go. So the entire region is experiencing this decline to varying degrees. Now, if you want to feel really good, you can look at Michigan. Y'all aren't Michigan. Michigan is off something like 16% with 17% to go. So they're going to lose 1/3 of their high school graduates, according to WICHE, from 2007 out to 2034. That kind of change should make us a little bit anxious. And so when I saw this map, I saw a version that was, I think, in the Chronicle. And it only, I think, had 3 colors, which meant the entire Northeast quadrant was dripping in red. My first thought was, wow, I should get my resume in order. Because while Carleton is a little bit more westward focused, we draw from this area. And more importantly, the entire higher ed industry draws from this area. This is where the majority, or the disproportionate number of students are coming from. So whether or not I'm drawing a particular student who isn't there doesn't really matter in a competitive environment where we're all looking for the same kinds of students. But the second thought was, but maybe this doesn't have anything to do with it. This was high school graduates, after all. So Carleton just serves a niche. All of you just serve a niche. So maybe I can ignore what's going on in the larger trend. What is causing the decline? Which subgroups are declining in number? If it's not the subgroups that are coming to us, then maybe I don't have to worry about it. For instance, I might think that the families with higher incomes and more education were not prone to be the large families to begin with. So how far could they have cut the fertility? So maybe the fertility decline was less prevalent or even not present in the subset of students that I teach. Now this phenomenon of noticing unfortunate data and then deciding that you don't want to deal with it is hardly uncommon, we're told by psychologists. In fact, it's a human trait. So there have been studies done on climate change that present people with data that contradict their priors. And the question is, how do people respond to that? Do they update their belief systems? And the answer is, well, no. They get stronger in their belief systems when confronted with data on the other side of the argument. And, really exciting, the more education you have, the stronger your propensity to dig in and reassert your prior. Now, I think it's pretty easy to figure out why that is. It's because that little mental dialogue I just described is more at hand for those of us who have multiple degrees, right? We're practiced at criticizing arguments. So I see the data, either I don't like the data or I disagree with the data, it doesn't matter which. If I'm uncomfortable, I start to spin stories that get me back to the place that I want to be. So I think that's pretty natural, but I don't think it's necessarily a healthy place to sit. I don't think we can ignore the data like this and just say, well, I can come up with a story where maybe it doesn't apply. And so instead I started a research project. I was leaving the dean's office and I had to do something. So the question is basically, is this sufficient? Are these head counts of high school graduates sufficient for planning? As I mentioned, this was part of the strategic planning exercise. I chaired one of the planning committees, and we did use the wiki data. But every time we did, I was a little bit uncomfortable because I knew I was at some level right, that data that would be provided to the local community college and to Carleton, right? It was the same data whether you were a community college or Carleton, as you're thinking about using the wiki data for planning. Probably wasn't data that I wanted to place just a ton of weight on. That I really wanted something that was a little bit more nuanced. So how do we know that this needs to be more nuanced? Well, we know that college going differs dramatically by student group type. So here we're looking at the geographic differences, and we can see in the upper left the broadest measure of college going. Do you attend college? In America today, about 70% of high school graduates will attend some college, a post-secondary institution, the fall after their high school graduation. But we can see that that's not equally experienced throughout the country. In the Northeast, we have about 3/4 of kids going on to college. Whereas by contrast, in the West, South, Central, where Texas is, it's less than 2/3 going to college. Now, in some sense, this just reinforces some of the concerns from the population data, because wait a minute, so we're losing kids exactly where we generally draw them from. And that's true, but it is a reminder that the head count isn't the thing. Who is in my pool matters as much as how big my pool is. And as we move from just do you go to college to do you go to four-year college in the upper right, or do you go to institutions ranked 51 to 100 by U.S. News and World Report. So there are 100 institutions here. You've got the National Liberal Arts Colleges and the universities list. So there's 50 of each in that group. Or then we go to the bottom right, the top 50 colleges and top 50 universities. We see that relatively speaking, these attendance gaps grow. So if we think about places like the LA colleges, it's even more pronounced that there are geographic differences in the propensity to attend. And the same thing is true when we look at differences by race ethnicity. So this is from the 2002 Education Longitudinal Study. I'll talk about that data more in a second, but you'll get something pretty similar if you look at more recent data. The most recent longitudinal study is the high school longitudinal study that just came out with that data. Hispanic enrollment rates have increased. That would be the big change over time here. But you still generally see that Asian Americans have a very strong attachment to higher education, much higher than African Americans and Hispanics. That is not driven by two-year college probabilities. Going to a two-year college is about equally likely regardless of race. It's largely driven by the four-year colleges, and more particularly by four-year colleges that are more selective. So we know that in that headcount data that says here's a high school graduate, here's a high school graduate, that's 1 and 1, we're missing something if we think that, well, but there are some subgroups that are more likely to attend than others. We also see differences, as you know, by parent education. You might not know the numbers in your head, but you know the feeling in your gut. That if you have a parent who goes to a four-year school and has a degree, you're much more likely to attend college. Again, this isn't predominantly about the two-year college going experience. Two-year colleges are an outcome that all families about equally participate in. It's a four-year college phenomenon. And again, more selective forms of education produce more pronounced differences in a relative sense. Those differences, we're looking one variable at a time. What if we put a bunch of variables together? So the 2002 Education Longitudinal Study is the Department of Education study that they looked at a representative sample of high school sophomores in 2002, and then they followed up with them over the years. And so I cherry-picked, admittedly, these two examples, these two hypotheticals. It's not as cherry-picked, ironically, as I could have made it. I've got an Asian American woman living in Boston with both parents. They have bachelor's degrees, family income $125,000. By contrast, we have a young man living in rural California. He's Hispanic, living with mother alone. She holds no diploma and earns $40,000 a year. The probability that she will go to a four-year college is almost certain, 96% in the ELS data. Whereas for the Hispanic young man, it's a 1 in 10 proposition. And yet again, when we look at headcount data, that's 1 in 1. So I'm not suggesting that these differences are something that we ought to like. In fact, we'll see that I'm going to argue we really better start thinking about these differences if we want to get through the demographic change that's coming. But I think as a starting point, we need to recognize that these differences exist so that we can ask the question, what if we and students continue doing what we've been doing, and we just see the demographic changes coming? How should we expect that to shape the market that we face? And then if we don't like what we see there, then we better get back to the question of, do you like these probability differences? And maybe we want to address some of the change with different recruitment activities. Now, just to see how it gets more pronounced as you move toward more selective forms of education, if we look at the probability of attending a school ranked among the top 50 colleges and universities, person A still has a probability of almost 3 in 4 chance of going to such an institution, whereas person B only a 2% chance. And I've got a 36-fold difference in the probability. And yet the headcount data, again, treats things 1 in 1. So the basic idea of my work was to take that data from the education longitudinal study. We've got about 16,000 high school sophomores there, representative of the country as a whole. And we can see where they go. And on the restricted side, we can see not only that they went to college, but exactly which colleges they attended. So using the IPEDS codes, I can distinguish a kid who went to an institution among the top 50 colleges and universities from a student who went to a four-year college that's, say, not ranked in the top 100 by either of those lists. I then combine those probabilities estimated from the ELS with census data from the American Community Survey. So there we've got a headcount survey. It's a 1 in 100 sample of the US. So we have observations of kids all over the country. And I've got demographic markers in common in these two data sets. And so I know the probability of college attendance estimated on the ELS based on a demographic type there, and I apply those probabilities to the same demographic groups over here. And because in the American Community Survey, I can see, well, here's a 17-year-old. They will be the 18-year-old college-age cohort next year. And here are 16-year-olds. They will be the cohort after that, and so on. We can look at how those population sizes are likely to change. And by applying the probabilities, we can get a sense of what's going to happen to our market. So if you like mathematics, I'm just thinking about expected values. And if you don't like math, I'm still thinking about expected values. So the basic idea of the model, if we think about it in really easy terms, we've got two populations, greens and purples. And it may look in the population like purples are the subgroup that is most important to our market. But if we know the probability of attendance is only 1/6 in the purples, then I don't know which of the 6 will attend. There's only one purple attendee out of that group, whereas by contrast, if 100% of the greens go on, then all 4 greens turn into 4 college attenders. And then we can layer on top of this notions about growth. So suppose we know the population of the purples is increasing by 1/6 over some time period while the greens are stable, then the college-going population goes from this to this. Looking at probability-weighted counts of the population. So the big, deep, profound observation of my work is that children get older 1 year at a time. That's kind of it. I'm an economist, so not that smart. Demographers answer really hard questions, like how many kids are going to be born in 10 years? I'll tell you, I haven't a clue. I don't know, and I pity the demographers who get asked that question. That sounds really hard. I'm just looking at kids who are already born, and so the big gray arrows here, we can think of as, I observe a 5-year-old in Oklahoma. 13 years later, that will be an 18-year-old Oklahoman. Now, reality is a little bit more complicated. We have a little bit of mortality to account for. We have to account for the fact that you're living in Oklahoma at age 5 doesn't mean you're still living there at age 18. So I adjust for migration between geographic areas. We have immigration into the system. So if I observe a non-native born child at age 5 in Oklahoma, that kid has to stand in for all of the other kids in that birth cohort who are going to arrive in subsequent years between ages 5 and 18. And then finally, family structure is an important determinant of the probability of college attendance. And I know that while I might see the child living with both mom and dad at age 5, that doesn't mean that they will be living in that family structure in 13 years. So there's an adjustment for family structure as well. So a little bit about the geographic areas here. I've got the states, but I break out from the states the 28 largest metropolitan areas. So in Minnesota, for instance, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area pops out as the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area. And then there's the rest of Minnesota, which I'll call non-metropolitan Minnesota, for lack of better phrasing. So we've got the 28 cities, and then the non-metropolitan portions of states. Now, I don't have actually 50 non-metropolitan portions of states in order to avoid getting really small counts. I aggregated up to geographic areas with at least 2 million people. So that means, for instance, when you take Denver out of Colorado, you don't have 2 million people anymore. So the non-metro Colorado gets merged with the contiguous non-metropolitan Wyoming, which is all of Wyoming, to create an area that has some mass. Out here, it gets a little interesting. So in Pennsylvania, you've got Pittsburgh, you've got Philadelphia, and you've got the rest of Pennsylvania. All of those are distinct areas. But the interesting part is with Philadelphia, and maybe more to the point, New Jersey. The Census Bureau is protecting all of our privacy, so they won't tell you really detailed geographic area in the American Community Survey. We use what are called PUMAs, which are these big geographic areas that have a population of a certain minimum number. And when you get into trying to adjust for migration between states, well, they'll tell you about migration patterns, but not even for PUMAs. They've got larger groups called migration PUMAs. So as it turns out, the entire state of New Jersey is divided between the metropolitan area that is Philadelphia and the metropolitan area that is New York City. There isn't a non-metropolitan New Jersey left over once I make those adjustments. So when we say Philadelphia here, it's going to include a good chunk of New Jersey. That's obviously a market that I know you all care about, and so I wanted to draw your attention to that. So what does the forecast look like? We'll start nationally, and it looks something like this. So I'm breaking it down here in the upper left. We have the forecast for projection rather for 2-year colleges, and then we have in the upper right 4-year colleges not ranked among the top 100 colleges or universities. So those top 2 are the bulk of higher education. You can see by the number counts there. There are about 3/4 of students go on, about 4 million kids in a birth cohort, and so you're getting the vast majority of students are attending either a 2-year college or a regional 4-year institution. Then in the bottom we have national colleges. Those are those colleges and universities ranked between 51 and 100, and then finally in the bottom right, the top 50 colleges and universities. So as I look at this, I notice 2 things. One is something in common, one is something different. So let's start with what's different. We can see that there's sort of this upward trend, especially in those top 50 schools, but you can even see it in the next tier down. So why is there an upward trend generally over time before we get to the mid-2020s? That has to do with 2 shifts in the population. One is an increasing share of Asian Americans. Asian Americans are a fast-growing subgroup in the United States. And they're highly attached to education, to 4-year education, and to selective 4-year education. Secondly, we've been really successful as an industry as a whole. We've tried to increase access, and we have. The share of parents who have college degrees is going up over time. And that's reflecting what we've done in the last several decades. And so as we project outward and we say, well, what's the distribution of children across parent education, you actually see that children are more likely to come with parents who have connections to higher education. And those people are more likely to send their students to 4-year schools and selective forms of 4 years in particular. So those 2 sort of demographic trends create this upward drift at the top of the selectivity range. Then you see the thing that's in common to all 4. When we hit the mid-2020s, that's 18 years after the financial crisis, and you start to see the drop-off in the projections, and that's just being driven by the drop-off in fertility. And I think you can see that we'll experience it differentially, but we're all going to experience it meaningfully. Now, you should stress that these are projections, not predictions, for a couple of reasons. The basic idea here is the assumption that behaviors will continue as they have in the past. Behaviors on the part of families and behaviors on the part of schools. So do I really expect that we would see from 2012 to 2025 a big run-up in the numbers of students enrolled at those top institutions, only to have those institutions then experience a painful contraction? No, I don't. They get to decide who they admit. They can say, the pool might be increasing for our product and we will just become more selective. We have seen some of these top institutions announce that they're increasing their class sizes. Yale, Princeton, University of Michigan have all recently announced increases to their class sizes. And I suppose looking at this, we can see why. They're experiencing an increase in demand that allows them to do that without suffering any loss in selectivity. But I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that enrollments will follow this plan for that reason, this trend for that reason. Secondly, as we experience these kinds of changes, or if we anticipate them, I hope that we will change how we engage as well, so that we are more interested in access, for instance, in a way that may change the college-going probabilities. So these are projections saying, what if we just do the status quo that foretells something that might be less than pleasant? But these are national projections, and we know that we all live in geographically inflected markets. I think, do we even have a handful of institutions in this country that don't have a regionally inflected student body? I'm not sure that we do. Certainly Carleton has a regionally inflected student body, and I know your campuses are as well. So looking at this on a more local level, here's what the forecast looks like for 2-year-old enrollment projections. We can see a lot of losses of at least 15% in the Northeast, and we can see the same kind of picture for those 4-year institutions ranked outside the top 100. And again, largely what's going on here is merely tracking the population. There's just not that much space between statements of the population as a whole and the population that goes to college, when 70% of kids go to college. They have to track together because so many kids are going to college at this point. It's hard to create too much space when you're looking at the bulk of higher education. Now you can start to get some different pictures though if you look at some narrower slices toward the top. Here we have those schools ranked 51 to 100, and we start to see that, wow, there's some opportunities out west. John McGee, in his great point, suggests that we should be thinking about recruitment probably as limited to about 500 miles around our institutions. I think that's actually pretty generous if you look at the typical travel distances of kids who are attending schools, even schools at the top of the selectivity range. You don't have the median being much further than a couple hundred miles. So 500 miles is a bit of a trek, as many of you admissions folks know. I think there are some states where you have people who move in and move out more often, and maybe you have a better chance, like California. Atlanta fits that description as well. But in general, if you're looking out to say, well, we're going to try to make a foothold in Oregon from here, you might have a reason why you think you can do it, but it's going to be a challenge. The Middle Atlantic in this region of national 4-year projections looks to lose 14%, while New England 25%. It's a tough picture. When we move up to the elite 4-year institutions, we see many more opportunities for growth. But critically, we don't see that being substantially different in the Northeast. At least we don't see the growth. The Middle Atlantic here is only losing 3%, being buoyed heavily by New York City. And then New England a loss of 15%. So we face some challenges in raw numbers. We can then ask what's going to happen to the composition of our students. So if I've got probability estimates of going to college and I sort of parse these kids up into what's the expected number of kids going into these different college types, we can break it down by race and we get a picture like this. So the far left here is looking at the population as a whole, just 18-year-olds. And we can see there that the share of non-Hispanic whites is projected to decrease. This is the story that you've probably picked up in the news over and over. The decrease in the black bar, non-Hispanic whites, is being driven by an increase in the yellow portion. That's the share of Hispanics. So the story that the country is becoming more Hispanic in its population share is absolutely true. And we can see that that is echoed then in 2-year college attendance and in 4-year college attendance in general. But there are some interesting distinctions. When you become more selective, you still face a more diverse population. But as we move toward more selective forms of education, it becomes more about Asian population growth and less about Hispanic population growth. And so we can all anticipate a more diverse student pool, but maybe what that diversity looks like may be different depending on what kind of institution you have. Now again, these are projections, not predictions. Will we see students at those top campuses become more represented by Asian students? Clearly there's a conversation going on right now between the Department of Justice and 2 lesser-known institutions. And if you're thinking that you might know those names, it just shows what an insider you are. The disposition of that case will determine whether or not these schools, in essence, have to follow the population, more or less, or whether they can lean against these population changes because they have other objectives in mind. But I think we can anticipate that at the top end, there are going to be more, relatively speaking, more Asian American students who are seeking education, if they don't end up at institutions in the top 50 colleges and universities, then I'd be thinking if I were the next tier, well, might we be well positioned to serve these students because they're looking for higher education and they're looking for a selective form of higher education. We can also break it down by parent education. And here the interesting thing is that we don't see a dramatic increase in the population in students who have no bachelor's degrees in model. And in fact, the fastest growing group is the group that has 2 bachelor's degrees. And this is just picking up that observation that we've been successful in the past. And you can see that that's going to be even more true, that you get more expansion of these second-generation students at the more selective forms of higher education. Now, I want to stress that this doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think it does mean, that we don't have the challenges of first-generation students. After all, when we think about what those first-generation programs are about, I think they're about trying to help students navigate the bureaucracies that we've created. So, I certainly came from a privileged background where my grandparents attended college. I don't know when I learned that a bachelor's degree required 4 years of education, for instance. It was just kind of a no. So I had a network that would help me navigate. But then some students who don't have that in family background can't necessarily find their way through our processes. So now we ask, are you a first-generation student? And it's not a bad proxy for it. Do you get us? Do you understand what we're about to do here? But in the future, when a student says, yeah, my mom's got a bachelor's degree, I'm not sure it would mean the same thing as when I said that when I went to college. When I said it in 1992, as I headed off to St. Olaf, they would have been very right to imagine a very narrow vision of what my parents' experience was. But in 2029, when a student says, yeah, my mom's got a bachelor's degree, well, the number of ways that you can get a bachelor's degree today is just, it's exploded, right? Did you go to a 2-year college and then transferred, or maybe you did some online work, or you bounced around? I just don't know that we can necessarily assume that in the future the problems of students who aren't institutionally savvy, I don't think that problem's going to go away. And in some ways it might get harder for us to deal with it because the proxies we've been using to identify which students need our attention maybe break them down. I'm going to skip this section. So how might we respond? Well, the way that I most commonly hear campuses saying that they're going to respond is we're going to recruit better. That might mean targeting domestic markets, old and new. Here we have actually an optimistic story. This is looking at the college attendance rates by race ethnicity. And if you look at the Hispanic numbers here, you can see that from about 2000 until today, we went from a gap of about 15 percentage points to today, when Hispanics are attending college at the same rate as the national average. It's a terrific story. Now, they're not attending 4-year colleges at the same rate, but the recent surge in enrollments has been disproportionately in the 4-year sector. So that's a wonderful story of success, and it suggests that we can recruit differently and we can reach out to new students. Though if you look at the African American attendance rate, you'll see that we've seen a period of closing the gap until 2010, and then the gap reemerged. So we've got some more work to do. Now, when we think about declining student numbers, that work to do is actually an optimistic point. The Hispanic rates here converging actually means that we don't have as much opportunity to recruit our way out of the declining numbers of students because they're already coming to colleges at least. So maybe those of us in the 4-year sector still have some work to do that makes it possible. But African Americans certainly is an attendance rate where we can figure out to better reach that community in a much better situation. What might that look like? The College Board, I don't want to shill for them. They'll sell just fine for themselves, but they do some interesting work. This is the Environmental Context Dashboard. What they've done is to take, and you can plug this right into Slate, so you can, as an admissions professional, you just click on a button and you see the student's record in context. Not only do you see their SAT score relative to their high school and their neighborhood's SAT score, but you also see in the bottom left there disadvantage index. So they've tapped into other US databases so that they can look at the student's neighborhood and school district when it comes to poverty, when it comes to income insecurity, when it comes to home ownership. And they've created an index of adversity. And their idea is, you might look at a student who's got an 1100 SAT, and maybe that's just below your typical cutoff. Might it change the way you view that student if you learned that, oh, by the way, they got to that point with all the possible advantages you could think of, versus, well, this student got there despite the fact that nobody in their school is getting close to an 1100 on the SAT. And oh, by the way, they're growing up in a neighborhood or a school where they have all sorts of disadvantages surrounding them. It might tell you something different about the student. University of Florida was one of the beta testers. they, as we expected, wanted to just jump into this wholeheartedly the first year, so they used it only in their bridge program. So they've admitted students, and then the bridge program is competitive, so they decided who we invite to the bridge program based on the dashboard. They liked it so much there that their director of enrollment said, okay, I want us to reopen. They hadn't yet sent the letters, but they had finalized their class. They said, this is our class. And so we want to reopen all the files of students who have a disadvantage index of 75 or higher. We're going to reread those files with this information in mind. They found an additional 1,000 to 2,000 students to admit that turned into 400 matriculants. So it seems to me that suggests, and the College Board has got research that suggests this isn't unique, that when you look at the profile of students through the lens of their environmental experience, it may change the way you look at their file. And this may be a way, and certainly it was in Florida, of identifying students from race ethnicity groups we don't intend to disadvantage. But in our general process, that's exactly what happens. And by bringing in additional context, Florida found that it dramatically moved the needle on the diversity of their classes. They found students whose, in light of the context, they thought, no, these students could definitely succeed here at Florida where they thought they couldn't before. We could recruit better internationally, though this politically is getting harder. In the last couple of years that we have data, we see a decline in the number of new international student matriculations. So we can recruit better, and I think we do need to recruit more effectively, and I think we need to re-examine our thoughts about the cost of diversity. The standard story that I certainly have heard is that there's a trade-off. You can either have net fee income, or you can have diversity we pick, right? Diversity is expensive, and there's truth to that, and that truth isn't changing. So when we hear about Lafayette's its devotion of money to the admissions process, it's going to have to be part of our way forward. But I think what we might need to reconsider as we look forward to a future that's even more diverse, and as we enter a generation that the Generation Z researchers, I understand you guys talked about that the last time you convened here, are telling us care a lot about diversity. It's not just that you won't reach the diverse students, you might be losing the WASPy students because they are experiencing a high school environment that's quite diverse, and when they step on some of our campuses and they say, well, this isn't as diverse as my high school campus. And they're frankly a bit turned off by it. Michael Kyle at St. Olaf College was explaining to me that the colleges, but rather high schools we don't recruit from, have a diversity profile that's far more diverse than where St. Olaf was, which is why he really pushed we have to diversify. Yes, it's expensive, but we have to pay the price today if we want to have a sound financial future. So I think we do need to think about that. But, okay, recruit better. That increase in Hispanic enrollment, 15 percentage points, really impressive. But that population is only 20% of the young people population. So we're talking about an increase of about 3% in enrollments, driven by a 15 percentage point surge in Hispanic enrollments. That's not enough to overcome the decline in the population we're facing. So yes, we should recruit better. Yes, our admissions folks should be on their A game. Yes, our marketing folks had better think seriously about how we're presenting ourselves. Yes, to be sure. But if that is the only response, if faculty members like myself wash our hands of what's coming and say, well, I suppose the admissions folks had better, do your thing so I have students to teach, we run a real risk. So I'm an economist, and this constitutes bead treating. Underflowing sky, it's really well written. It's a history of the Great Pinky Firestorm of 1894. So a firestorm, for those of you from out west, you know what this is. A firestorm is not a wildfire. It's a fire that's gotten so intense it creates its own weather. And so Brown describes what we've seen out west, where you have tornadoes of flame that are throwing logs ahead of the storm. You so dry out the environment in front of you, the entire mountainsides have gone up in flame as if soaked in gasoline just when the first ember touches. It's that kind of firestorm. This firestorm consumed 400 square miles in 4 hours. The first town to get hit was Hinckley. A train had just come into the station, and so they hopped on the train. They didn't have time to turn it around. They ran backwards up the track, pulling on the whistle the entire way. Their hope was that Sandstone, which was something like 7 miles on the track, would hear the train coming off schedule, running the whistle the entire way, and come out to the platform so they could hop on the train and be saved. And many people in Sandstone did just that. They came to the platform and they saw their Hinckley neighbors, their clothes burned off, gasping for air, hanging out of the train, begging the Sandstone neighbors to get on the train. And most of the Sandstone neighbors said, we've seen wildfires before, I think I'm going to go back to my farm and take care of it. And many of them died. So it's a sobering reminder, Brown tells us, that psychology is useful and harmful all at once. Psychologists tell us that we are trained and our brains want to see patterns. That's how we get through life. It's a God-given blessing that I see a pattern. I did something, it worked well, I get a dopamine hit, and I lay down a neural network. And I think, I'm going to do that again, that felt good. And I do it again, if it works, I get another dopamine hit, and that neural network is reinforced. And it changes my brain. I start to see patterns. I want to see patterns, which is terrific, right up until paradigm shift. And then Brown points to research by people like Dan Ariely, who point out that when the paradigm shifts, you still want to see the old pattern. I want to see the fact remember that, oh, demographic change? Yeah, okay, admissions, do your thing. I don't have to change the way I teach. It doesn't have to affect me. Except what if it's a bigger change than we've seen in the past? And what if that attitude gets us into trouble? Ariely points out there was a soccer match where there was a fire that broke out in the stands. And there were many people who could have been saved by hopping a 4-foot wall and jumping on the soccer pitch, this enormous green field in front of them. And instead they ran into the stadium because that's where the exits were. Right? Your brain has a pattern that there are exits, and when there's a fire drill, you go out the exits, except you shouldn't be going out the exits when that's where the fire is. But our brains just want to go down the same track. So yes, we should recruit more effectively. Yes, we should close racial gaps. Yes, we should be making higher education more accessible, but that's probably not going to be enough. We're probably going to see more change than that. We're probably going to see price competition. This is looking at the share of, so this actually works well for those of us on the independent private side. This is looking at the share of education at public institutions that's paid for by the family. You can see that when I went to college, it was about a quarter. As we entered the financial crisis, it was about a third. Now it's about a half. So we're seeing that those publics are bearing the costs of the state's pulling back their allotments to higher education. That's going to buffer things to some degree. But on the other hand, we see a lot of institutions that are talking about resetting prices in one way or another. So this was a Chronicle study. They found that 20% of private colleges are at least thinking about rolling back tuition. Now there's again thinking about, and there's actually doing. And what does rolling back look like? I don't know. But I know that this is, in the end, probably a zero-sum game. We can't collude, so I don't want to talk about colluding. But let's be honest, if we all drop our prices, we end up with less fee income. And frankly, what we do by providing a high-quality education costs a lot. So I don't know what to do about this. I think we are going to see more competitive environments. We're going to have to think about how we deal with that. I hope that we're going to see more attention on retention. We have talked about retention a lot. Sometimes I hear people say, well, we've talked about that forever. Yes, we have, but we haven't solved the problem. This is the national data for 4-year institutions. We can see there is a gentle upward slope there. We've done a little bit better, but still, 1 out of every 4 kids who starts at an institution in the fall, a 4-year institution, will not be there a year later. Now, I know at Carleton, okay, there are some stories where if that was the plan, I was going to go here and then I was going to transfer. At Carleton, though, it is not the case that kids come in the fall of their first year and think, no, in a year, I'm going to be out of here. They're thinking in 4 years, they're going to walk across that platform, shake the president's hand, and have their diploma. And I think it's time maybe to revisit the personal tragedy that is often the case with a student leaves the institution. When we had more students on the corner at every turn, so in essence, as a faculty, you say, well, okay, we didn't reach that one, but give me another. That was actually tenable, but we're not in that situation. Many of our campuses could mitigate the loss that's coming in the potential number of prospective students if we just retained the ones we already had. Or put it another way, the cheapest student to recruit might already be sitting on your campus. Marty Swidell at Goucher College put it this way. He said, we spend all this money and resource and time to identify students, we bring them to campus, we show them our campus, we find good matches, but then who is re-enrolling our students? And that has to be a challenge for all of us. Dennis Hanno, president of Wheaton College in Massachusetts, has put a bounty out on their first-year retention rate. He viewed it as a strategic problem, that they didn't have a higher retention rate. And to drive home the point that the responsibility of re-enrollment belongs to all of us, he said, okay, everybody on campus gets a 1% raise when we hit my target. I think that's lovely in the way that it articulates that this is an issue that is about staff of all types and faculty. It could be the janitor. I think about my roommate in college in our junior year, he spent lunch downstairs in the basement with the janitor most days, watching some soap opera that they watched together. At reunion, he'll seek her out. I don't think that's uncommon. Our students make really close connections with staff members, maybe who are working in the spaces that they live, or the students are working with in student work. So yes, the person who's working in the parking lot is part of our retention strategy. And yes, the faculty member who's seeing these students day after day has to be part of the retention strategy. Rutgers is doing some interesting stuff with student work, speaking of student work. They've identified Pell Grant students who are retaining their jobs from high school in especially retail. And they realize that this isn't working well. You get to December and it's finals, and these students who retained their retail positions are probably not going to get a whole lot of slack from their retail employers. That's not the time that they need time off. Whereas if they were working in the library, they might be able to downsize their hours in order to study. When they have a bad exam and they're maybe a little bit downcast, if they have a work supervisor who even cares to ask, that work supervisor at Target has no idea how to connect you to tutoring services. But if they worked in the library, they would have an adult on campus who understood the resources that are available. I think that's an ingenious way to rethink how we can better leverage student work as a retention program. By identifying specific positions in the library, the rec center, and student centers, they're going to provide some extra training for those student work supervisors. They're creating a cohort program, and they've asked that there be 90 student work slots that are designated, earmarked in those areas for these students that they know they're trying to target for improved retention. I think creative thinking like that matters. I think creativity also requires us to understand that students are holistic students. And here I want to be careful with the example I'm going to give. It sounds like we're trivializing something that's really important. This is from DePaul. I was on their campus and they were excited to show me their new diversity center. And one of the things that they said was in their Center for Diversity and Inclusion was a hair salon. And they explained that in Greencastle, Indiana, it's a small northern town. There's nobody in that town who knows how to cut African Americans' hair. And they know this because they listened to their students who said, hey, you want to know why I don't feel like I belong here? Because in some sense I don't belong here. And the students obviously weren't saying that haircut is the thing. It was just emblematic of the way that the campus was missing even small things. And so they've put a salon in here and they've contracted with someone who does know how to cut African American hair to be on campus on a regular basis, just to try to address that gap on one hand, but also to communicate to students that, yeah, you matter, that the small things that make you feel like you don't belong matters. I think there's a lot we can do, whether it's faculty or staff, to think better about retention, and that will go a long way. Greater attention to student motivations. Students come to our campuses because they think it's an investment. And I know that we don't always want to think of it that way. This is a survey from Gallup Strata. Interestingly, 58% of students said the reason they chose their level of education, so what degree type they wanted, was because of a good career job, and 23% said because they cared about the learning or knowledge involved. What I find interesting about this most is that somebody wrote this survey. So those are mutually exclusive categories, right? Somebody like me probably wrote this. Would you like to go to college of this type in order to get a good job or career, or do you want to learn something? Because those two are not related at all. I'm sure the students were befuddled, like, okay, I can only choose one here. But you can see that if I have to choose, I want to get a good job. And when we look at which institution are you going to attend, location is the #1 answer there. But we see the same thing. The good job or career, that was 19% versus 5% saying learning and knowledge. Students want to see that what they're doing here is relevant. And it's connected, since Gallup Strata, with their perception of the value of our degree. So here on the x-axis, we run from 2 to 10, a measure of how relevant you found your experience in higher education. And then on the y-axis, we have measures of whether you found it to be a strong value, your education was worth the cost, and whether you agreed that you had a high-quality education. We can see that students who felt like they had a relevant learning experience, what they learned was relevant to their day-to-day lives and or their work, they say they got a really high value, good, it was worth the cost, high-quality experience. But if they don't see the value, they don't feel like they got a high-quality experience. Just talking to Allison before this, I want to stress this isn't about let's all become STEM majors and let's get rid of our English programs and our language programs. The data on this, we've not done a good job of convincing everyone else, but the data on it are clear that the liberal arts degrees, and the humanities in particular, are preparing students in all sorts of relevant ways. And in fact, I see all sorts of evidence that the STEM fields have got, and I don't mean this as an insult, they're doing their part, but it's got a lot of control. I see headlines about technology interacting with us in ways that don't seem to reflect the human nature of us. And you think, gosh, if only there were disciplines that spent rigorous time thinking about what it is to be human and what that means about how you interact with the world. So this argument of relevance is not about science versus humanities. It's just rather about, can we lean into the relevance? Can we articulate for students and help them articulate to employers the relevance of the studies that they are engaged in, whether they're studying philosophy, they're studying economics, or they're studying art history, I don't care. I believe they are learning relevant skills, but they aren't necessarily able to see it or to articulate it. We need to perhaps think about program revision. Illinois has been doing some interesting thing with computer science plus degrees. So computer science plus anthropology, computer science plus linguistics, think Siri, computer science plus music. And so the students get some basic computer science introductory courses coupled with their degree in often humanities field. It's an interesting way to create clearer connection to the relevance, even in fields that you might say, well, okay, so in music, they've got to struggle on relevance. I don't think they necessarily have to struggle. I think our musicians, our music faculty are able to articulate the relevance. Credentialing, we probably will have to confront this. We're going to have to confront this certainly as competitive, that people are going to find alternative ways to get what they want out of higher education without necessarily getting 40 degrees. We may want to identify places where we want to engage in credentialing, whether a way of creating badges or other ways of packaging the coursework that our students are doing so that they can better articulate the skills that they have. And finally, closure and consolidation is likely to happen around this. We've seen an uptick recently. If you read the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed about this time of year, every year, you run into a spate of stories that are really challenging. Now, you can close, or you can stay open, but shift your focus. So as a liberal arts professor, these stories break my heart. You've got recurring stories about closing of departments that are typically in the language and the humanities. I saw this just recently. In the last 3 years, 651 foreign language programs have been closed. So these institutions didn't close, but they've changed their type. And I don't want to be judgmental. So UW Stevens Point is making a bet. There's this pre-professional student group out there that they're trying to serve. Not every college has to look like Carleton. In fact, I look with a bit of admiration. They're willing to have a deep conversation about what is our identity, who are we, and let's hew to that. And that's what I think we all can do. We can all ask, what is our mission, and how do we better fulfill that? If we answer that question correctly, I think there is a demand for all kinds of institutions. And with that, I'll leave a final thought. This comes from Ed Bennett, who's a consultant at the EAB, and a blog post where he made an observation connection to Taleb's book called Anti-Fragile. And in particular, Bennett was asking whether higher education could be an anti-fragile system. So Taleb writes that anti-fragility is beyond resilience or robustness. So he says, look, there are 3 kinds of systems. There's the fragile system. You put it under stress and it breaks. Then there's the resilient system. And a lot of us, I think, tend to think that this is maybe the best that it can be. You just hunker down. Here comes the stress, and it's going to get through. It's not going to break you. But you don't come out and change. You're the same system. And then there's the anti-fragile system. Bennett says it's like the human body. You go work out, you put it under stress, and it comes out stronger. And Bennett is asking, might higher education be an anti-fragile system? That the stresses that we're experiencing demographically are going to push us to better fulfill our missions, so that we come out transformed, better versions of ourselves, making changes that we would want to make even if we didn't experience the stress. I think that's kind of interesting. I mentioned Bennett's idea to Barbara Brittman, who's the president of what was NEASC and is now NESH, I think they call themselves, the accreditation agency in New England. And they're kind of ground zero of this mess. And she understandably didn't necessarily like Bennett's idea. She said, yeah, under enough stress, your body breaks too. And so I was thinking about that. I was thinking, that's true. It's like a car accident. That's too much stress. But the physicists will tell you kind of cheaply that it's not the speed that kills, it's the acceleration, right? So if you take the analogy a step further then, we are going to experience stress. We get to choose right now just how much stress we experience. We can see that there are going to be continual changes happening. If we take action now, we can take that stress and spread it out over a long period of time and maybe experience it as a good, robust workout, transforming us in ways that make us stronger. But if we instead dig our heels in and say, no, we're going to do the same things the same way, and I'm not going to change until I really get forced to. But when that force comes, and it probably will for most of us, then we get to experience the car accident type of stress because we compress the time into just this short amount of time. And so I think we have an opportunity, and I hope that, that's the message that comes through. We have challenges that are coming. There are things that we can do, and I look forward to this afternoon talking about, hearing about some of those ideas from you all. What can we do to get in front of this? Hopefully not to do damage to who we are, but rather to better fulfill the missions that we are always aspiring to do and never quite fulfill. Right? We can't quite get there. But we can always push ourselves to more closely fulfill our missions. And might this be a time, especially, to be doing that so that we have better value propositions to students and we can continue to make the argument for higher education in general and for our institutions in particular. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
So part of the data that you presented said that in the population of African American students who are going to matriculate to college, that there's going to be a decline that's proportionately more aggressive than other demographics, right? Do you have any best practices for retention of those populations that have been studied somewhere, and if so, what are your sources?
Yeah, so going back to the decline rate, 2/3 of it is just because of declining numbers. That African Americans are becoming a smaller share of the population. Then the other 1/3 is that is changes in probabilities, which must mean that race is correlated with some of the other predictors, whether that's income or family composition or geography. So when we think about how do we address this, well, 2/3 of that decline in share is being driven by the kids just aren't there. Over at Bucknell, Bill Connolly was quoted in the Chronicle as saying, I can't recruit the kids who have more, or something like that. So there's a bit of that. So you're right, I mean, the next thing we want to think about is, okay, retaining the ones that we do have. And no, I don't have great ideas there. I would be thrilled to hear people who have figured it out. I think HBCUs have had much higher retention rates, and so I think we can turn to them for some ideas. But one thing we have to be careful is, as with so many things, you look from the outside and you say, yeah, I want what they have. My understanding from people who study this, and I haven't, is that when you go look at it, what you find out is, yeah, those institutions were originally set up very, very deliberately to serve that purpose, which is another way of saying they've invested in a very holistic way, in a way that's paying off. So you don't do this on the cheap. It's not like there's going to be a magic bullet you're going to find out there. What you're going to hear is something that's going to cost you. And so you better be prepared to think about, okay, so I'm willing to make the investment to actually make this happen. What I heard this in the context of a comparison of Hispanic serving versus HBCUs. So retention rates of African American men were indeed much higher at HBCUs than other schools. But with the Hispanic serving institutions, there didn't seem to be a big difference in retention rates compared to other institutions. And the author's observation was that HBCUs were actually set up for this purpose, whereas Hispanic serving institutions have more or less developed kind of organically over time. They weren't set up for this purpose, they just ended up having large Hispanic populations. And so the question was, is that really, maybe that's the difference in why Hispanic serving institutions aren't necessarily better able to retain? Because there's nothing really about those institutions in their foundational core that was designed for that purpose. Which isn't a critique, it's just an observation, right?
Hi. Yeah, did the data reveal regarding gender, will women continue to outnumber males as far as graduation rates go?
So the answer to my projections is yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean what you're getting at, because the basis of the model again is saying what if the probability model continues forward as it has in the past. And so in 2002 ELS, women were more likely to attend than men, and this is just projecting that out in the future. So what will actually happen? We don't know. I guess I kind of hope that we can figure out how to reach out to them and that we can make that projection not hold. But the projections here, because women, unlike with African Americans, I said about 1/3 of the difference in the future is driven by changes in probabilities. That's because African Americans are disproportionately found. There's a correlation between the other demographic markers and race. But there's not much difference in correlation between girls and boys and all the other demographic markers. I mean, being a girl or a boy is pretty much randomly determined in the United States. We don't have some sort of selection mechanism that makes them more likely to be found in low-income families or something like that.
Thank you very much for your talk. One point that you made in the talk that comes through in more detail in your book is the idea that as competition grows stronger, as the number of students decline, given the higher likelihood of more elite institutions to draw students effectively, the tendency will be for them to each layer to cannibalize the layer below it, so that in the end there's a kind of stratification where the schools at the very top of the pecking order are simply taking students who would otherwise have gone someplace else, and hence the ones at the bottom of whatever the perceived pecking order is, have the most difficulty. Especially especially given all of the conversation in the news in the last few weeks about the day news is sort of focusing on high prestige institutions. You know, do you have any thoughts about the ways in which higher ed could try and counter the focus on elitism and selectivity that seems likely to, if anything, be aggravated by the kind of trend you're describing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if we are already seeing, in part because of the coverage about the scandal in the last couple of weeks, not that that creates, but rather that I think it surfaced a lot of emotions surrounding higher ed. So things that could change relative to what the probability models in my work implicitly assume. One key thing is we have been in an era where people assume that high price means high quality. And that generally runs along with this prestige index, but it also runs into things like how we do financial aid. It's not clear to me that that has to continue. I don't know that it will change, but I think our marketing folks are going to continue to ask that question. Are we best positioned by having a high fee and discounting, or in some of our institutions does it just make sense to revisit that model because it doesn't necessarily communicate what it used to communicate? Yeah, I think if you look at Carolyn Oxby's work, she's found this is hardly new, this sorting and ever-increasing sorting. In the 1960s, you would see a strong association between the school's prestige and the SATs, those scores of students. But over time, I think in part I think two things have changed. The technology of travel and communications improved, so there's been a technology change. But also the returns to higher ed have increased. And so I think at least students perceive that somehow the value of getting into, say, Princeton relative to Carleton or Lafayette is somehow higher than it once was. And so for a bunch of reasons, Oxby's identifying that you're starting to get, okay, now if you were at a top-ranked school, your SAT scores are really high, and you just get this increasing sorting. So it's been a long-term trend. I don't know what's going to stop it.
I'm just wondering, as you're talking about the role of the market in all this, higher ed has expanded tremendously in the last 50 to 100 years. So basically, in a way, are we just going through a market correction, and as a result, the reality is this is what's going to happen, and you might be the salesman who's here to kind of save us, but no matter what we do, the market will correct and the losers will lose.
Yeah, there could be some of that. I mean, with 70% of kids already going to college, there is only so much you can do. What levers can you pull collectively to try to get that attendance rate higher? Now, I know that among Asian Americans, the attendance rate is 80%. So in macroeconomics, there's a debate about just how low can the unemployment rate go before inflation sets in. Ultimately, it's an empirical question, but we seem to be skittish about finding out, right? We don't want to push it too low and then find out that we have massive inflation. And so, there are people who say, well, I don't really think we should push beyond 4%. When you break down the data, you see that, well, wait a minute, not all races are equally experiencing the market success right now. It seems kind of curious that we would be willing to accept 9% unemployment rate for African Americans, and you're going to say that, well, you can't do any better than this, you just have to live with it. So, do we need to live with the 7% union cap? I guess I'm thinking, I kind of hope not. Not necessarily that everybody's going to get a 4-year degree. I think that's really not what we're talking about. But in the global economy, I think needs for at least a 2-year diploma are increasing. So maybe we can find a way out. If we're going to do that, we're tapping into a harder and harder. These last 30% of people who said no, even if the vast majority said yes. So we're going to have to work pretty hard. We're going to be exactly where you suggest at their limits. And then the only question is, who's going to be holding the bag? Is it going to be you, or is it going to be me? And maybe some other colleges go out of business entirely, and you take a 10% cut, and you do a 5% cut. And let's be honest, if Carleton lost 5% of students, we'd be okay. I might not have the same salary trajectory. We might revisit how much Carleton contributes to my retirement plan. But okay, could we sort it out? Yeah, we can sort it out. We sorted out the financial crisis. And Carleton did that in 2 months. I don't know how your budget process works. You have an 18-month budget process, trustees pass the budget, and then a couple weeks later, the market tanked, and they said, hey, never mind, give us a new budget, and we got to cut millions. And we did. We just did. I had one college president say to me, look, it's not a plan to cut. Right? So, to take the fatalistic, look, this is coming, so let's just cut. So that's not a plan. Because if you start trying to get your way through this by cutting, especially if you're the one who's more endangered, probably you're eliminating programs, it's just cutting, that then makes the institution less appealing to students, which means you have to cut more, which makes it less appealing to students, and you just enter a death spiral. He said, you plan for something that has a chance of success. If it doesn't work, well, cutting's not hard. He said, I can do it in about 15 to 30 minutes. It's brutal. But, you want 15% out of my budget? It's not rocket science. It's just really painful. So I fear that there are even some institutions, especially those who don't care to make changes, and especially those that are already at risk, where it's going to be hard not to have some real discomfort.
So you focused on 17, 18-year-olds. Could you say a word or two about non-traditional age students?
Yeah, great question. The focus is on that because that's where I have the data. The education longitudinal study followed kids up to, I believe, age 26, which is right when you start to get into the non-traditional market. I'm not honestly sure that it would have given us a ton of information about non-traditional market patterns. You really need to know where their high school is from, et cetera. But I wouldn't mind finding out. And time after time, these longitudinal studies have stopped right around 26, and so we have sort of a blind spot in the data about the patterns of non-traditional. It's certainly true that one place where in the past we have, and where we may yet look in to deal with declining numbers of traditional age students, is to go to non-traditional. The Gallup Strata studies suggest that we need to be careful and being too optimistic about that. When asked, where would you turn if you needed to retool? The number one answer that adults gave was, I would go to my employer. A regional university was not their top answer. So then they thought, well, maybe if we go to people who say, I have some college no degree, maybe they will be more likely to name the university. Hey, I'll just get the last few credits and finish up. No, they were less likely. So they were curious, and so they did follow qualitative interviews. What they heard was, okay, yeah, you don't get it. I left for a reason. They were unreasonable. It was bad customer service, in essence. You made it hard for me to say yes to the degree the first time, and so I got out of there. And now you're asking me would I like some more? So I think we have to be careful in presuming on the adult learning market. Pam Eddington, who's the president at Bunker Hill Community College in Massachusetts, was at an institution in California that went to this transition to the adult learner focus, and now she's leading that initiative at her own campus. And she said, we're looking through every one of our processes, recognizing that adult learners just have completely different needs. And so it's not enough to bring them to campus. You then have to change who you are and become more student ready instead of asking them to accommodate you. She said one just not so trivial example was they identified to register for classes at Bunker Hill, you need to go to campus for 2 days for an orientation, which isn't unreasonable for an 18-year-old, I suppose. But when you're thinking about adult learners who have kids and maybe a job, you say, no, we will not take your money until you've been on campus on 2 separate days, and only then can you register. She said, that's just not serving us well. We need to figure out how to streamline things, everything from when classes are offered. So I think adult learners are an interesting place that a lot of people are turning. We just have to be careful to, it's really the same issue as thinking about the African-American student population. You can't just say, well, okay, now we decided we want you and expect that to work. You have to be open to change.
Thank you very much. One more.
One more question then. First of all, thanks. I've read your book. I found it thought-provoking and enjoyed the talk. You've said some interesting things about what projections are, so I'd like to ask you to speak as a canary in the coal mine rather than a data scientist right now. You've started to talk around the country about this to presidents and to faculty and to presumably general citizens and legislators. What you're saying is what goes forward depends on how we change. Where have you seen the various populations be responsive and thinking about creatively how to move forward as opposed to the intractable, let's do the same? Because it's not just the data, it's what happens.
Yeah, so in my experience is obviously selective, because I get invited by people who are presumably interested in thinking about change. And so I've actually been really encouraged, because everywhere I've gone, I've seen people who were open to all sorts of conversations about changing academic programs, rethinking what we have to do in terms of student support, and that's with staff, but also in terms of faculty engaged in student support when we reach new student groups. And I've seen institutions that seem to recognize that A, this is a significant challenge, and that B, it's going to involve lots of people being open to behaving differently. So I think the campuses that I've seen suggest that. Now, again, it's a selected group. I'm sure there are lots of campuses who didn't. I don't even know if they read the book, or maybe they did and they didn't like it. And then they didn't have me, and they said, well, we're not going to change, because I'm sure we'll be just fine. And I think the biggest concern that I have is I suppose, obliviousness, not just complacency. Because I think you should be alert for change, even if you think your institution is in a good spot. I went to a National Clearinghouse session at the ACROA meetings, which is the enrollment management / registrars folks, and they had a data presentation that identified very similar trends, and then they had a roundtable discussion. The first 3 comments from the floor were of a variety. Well, this looks very challenging nationally, but the feeder schools that we work with are demographically strong, so we're actually in a good spot. Wow. That seems like a very dangerous attitude. So what you just said was the national averages look really tough, but actually it's worse than that for my competitors because I'm in a good spot, which means, given what averages are, that they're in a worse spot. And they're just going to take it. They're not going to notice that the school I'm recruiting from is actually healthy and come seek out my market. And so I can just keep doing what I've been doing. That seems really, really unlikely to work. And so I think, that sort of, I've looked at it and I decided that I'm above the fray is probably the thing that I worry about most. And I've seen that a little bit. But I've mostly seen really constructive college leadership that's made me really optimistic about the future, even if it does involve reprioritization, let's put it that way, instead of cuts, because I think that's really what we've been thinking about is, okay, we can't afford to do all of these things, but we do have to make investments to get through this. So we're going to have to do some thoughtful reprioritization. I've seen leaders who are taking on that process very constructive.
Thank you very, very